But we would expect the same level of rigor and scrutiny to be applied to the crudes that are coming into Europe. And so that's why we've encouraged the European Union to undertake a comprehensive, truly comparative study of the crude oils that come into Europe, and to really get an analysis, a complete analysis done of what is the carbon intensity of the EU crude diet. Because without that, the picture is incomplete. Without that, you're not comparing apples to apples. In fact, you have a very granular level of analysis done on the oil sands, with a very vague level of analysis done on the rest of the crude that's coming into Europe. So I think that that is, our main concern here. Let's have an equal treatment. Let's have a level playing field, indeed, for the different crudes that are being used in Europe. I think that what I just want to do is look at one slide, if I can figure this out. This is actually just to show you where the oil sands are. But when you think about where oil is located in the world, there are 14 countries that hold 91% of global oil reserves. It is not exactly a democratic spread of the resource. Of those 14 countries, Canada is has the third largest reserves in the world. And we have some of the strictest environmental regulations for oil development in Canada. The oil sands are one of, I would say, looking on this list, the only source of oil on that list that has a carbon price applied to them. In Alberta, there's a price on the carbon for all heavy emitters across all sectors. That's already applied at source. And so you have, in Canada, a very different regime for oil development than you have in the rest of the world. And I think that the message, and we're very transparent about the data. We've provided it internationally, we've provided it to the European Union. And what we've seen is that that data has made us a target. And I think that that's, you have to really wonder about the message that that sends. The European Union has focused all of its attention, all of these debates, all of the different studies on the oil sands, on this particular source of oil. And they're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is, what is their actual crude diet? What are they actually consuming in Europe? And what is the carbon intensity of that diet? Because I think that if they looked at that a little bit closer, they'd have some very difficult questions to answer.
Okay. Could I have them? That works, I think. Okay. And finally, to come to Pierre Noël from the Energy Policy Research Group at Cambridge University. I don't think he has any slides.
Yeah, does it work? Yeah, it does. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've conceived of my role tonight as maybe giving some numbers. Some numbers have already been given. I hope that mine are complementary to those that have already been given to you. The first thing I would like to say is that the EU is a shrinking part of the global oil market. In 1990, so 20 years ago, the EU represented 21% of global oil consumption, and today it's 16%, and in 2030 it should be around 10%. So 20% in 1990, 10% in 2030. The emerging part of the world outside the OECD, represented 37% of world oil consumption in 1990, 47% today, and could be 60% in 2030. So, I mean, this story is happening elsewhere. That's a fundamental fact we should keep in mind. The EU is not only declining in relative size, EU oil consumption in Europe has been declining in absolute values for many years now, several years, let's say. So if the EU consumes, assuming the EU consumes any oil products that come out of tar sands, if it decides not to consume it anymore, it's just going to be consumed elsewhere. That's going, that doesn't even show on the screen if you want, if you look at the components of global oil supply, or demand, sorry. The second thing I wanted to say is what we're talking about on the supply side. Tar sands are growing quite fast, I mean at least much faster than global oil supply, generally speaking, but they're quite small. They represent today approximately 2% of global oil supply, depending on how what you put in the mix. And they could represent maybe double that, 4% in 2030. So to summarize the first 2 points, you've got a small and declining consuming area or group of countries that is trying to regulate a rising but small part of global supply. And so you sort of wonder, well, why are we doing this? And perhaps then we might be doing this because, with a view that we want to eventually, incentivize or force European oil companies to divest, not to invest anymore in those regions. So I don't know if that's the objective, but if that's the objective, then European oil companies, Total, Shell, BP, those who are operating there in Canadian tar sands, they don't have any particular competitive advantage in this business. So if you remove them, they're going to be replaced by others to produce the liquid fuels that the world is desperate for. So if that's the case, if that's the objective, it seems to me the policy is also going to be futile. But just for the sake of it, for the interest of it, let's just assume that the EU would, or any other cause, by the way, any other actors or set of constraints, would manage to stop the development of Canadian tar sands and leave it as it is now, leave the production as it is now. And taking those, I didn't take the CIRA numbers, I took the IEA numbers on the carbon intensity. And basically between the most carbon-intensive tar sand projects and Saudi Arabian crude, you have a difference of 100 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. So you do the numbers, you leave it at the production today, and you project to 2030, and you sort of assume that otherwise tar sands would have grown in a linear way, if you want, from where they are now to where the IEA projects them to be in 2030. And what you save is 730 million tons of CO2 over 20 years. So let's put that in context. 730 million tons is 40% of the growth in global CO2 emissions in 2010, just in 2010. Over 20 years, you would save 40% of the growth, global growth, in 2010. And just to compare with another point of comparison, in the EU, currently, the CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants are a bit more than 900 million tons. So you would save in 20 years less, sort of 20% less than 1 year of coal-fired power plants in the EU. So to stick to this number, if you displace this, 25% of this coal, this electricity and heat generating coal in Europe, you replace 25% of it by gas, you save 116 million tons per annum of CO2 emissions. That is more, significantly more, than the total growth in EU emissions in 2010. So in other words, I turn to my, representatives in the EU Parliament and EU policymakers in general. And I asked them, what are you looking at? What are you spending your time on? This issue, tar sands in Canada, will never give you value for money in terms of the policy you're trying to put in place, but also in terms of the time you spend on it. I think the opportunity cost of policymakers and regulators is something that very few people look at, but I think it's something that we should look at. And my message is you should really look at something else if the objective is to have a sensible climate policy. And I think I'm going to stop here, and I hope we can have a debate afterwards.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you to all our speakers. Mrs. Hussey, I think you're probably dying to come back on some of the points that have been made. Maybe particularly if you could pick up on Pierre Noël's last point about the opportunity cost, but also on Jeanette's question about are tar sands being singled out, and other problem sources or other sources that are carbon intensive not being. Are you as a policymaker looking at that with the same degree of intensity? It should. Okay,
now it should be on.
Is it on?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. First, this point on something being, why to single out Canadian tar sand? My understanding and my experience is not that it's not members of European Parliament, it's not EU who is singling Canadian tar sand. We are working to implement a legislation which was adopted 3 years ago. But Canadians have started to campaign that tar sand oil should have a special treatment, campaigning for having the same default value for tar sand based oil than other fossil as other fossil oil. And if we would do that, that would undermine the whole point of that specific legislation. So it's not we who have raised this point of Canadian tar sand oil. But I would like to point out that whatever we decide on default values for tar sand oil, it's not specifically on Canadian tar sand oil, it's for all tar sand oil. I'm happy to see that there is at least one point of agreement with Mrs. Patel and me, and it's a differentiation of different crude oil sources. I'm not at all an expert. I can't tell what are the most practicable ways to do that, but if there is somebody who has good ideas, then I'm more than pleased to hear these ideas. But concerning this point, what are you looking at? I have heard this point before. I come from a small country, and almost always when I'm discussing with energy-intensive industry representatives on climate protection as a whole, one of their arguments is that the CO2 emissions of our nations are so tiny fraction of global emissions. So why should we reduce our emissions? My country is 5 million people. Every 5 million people on this planet could say the same. This is not a way forwards. We hear also in Brussels, and at least I have heard a zillion times, arguments saying that European Union as a whole is responsible for only that and that percentage some years ago, I think it was 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Others are producing much more. Okay, that's true, but the problem is that there is not a single the other one who is producing all the rest. It's the global greenhouse gas emissions all from various kinds of sources, and planned measures concerning every source can be resisted with this argument that this and this is only so and so tiny fraction of what's happening globally. So let's others do the job and don't make our life difficult. We need to work on all sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And as Noosa pointed out, transport as a sector, that's one of the worst. Transport is the sector where the trend is the worst. Other sectors have reduced emissions on average after 1990, but transport has increased emissions dramatically. So transport definitely must be tackled, and but there is not a silver bullet which does the whole thing. We need modal shift. We need more public transport, more better biking lanes. We need all kinds of measures. But if we want our climate policy as a whole to be ridiculed, then the most certain way to do that is to be not honest with figures which are the basis of politics in some fields. So if we cheat with figures concerning carbon footprint of oils a couple of years after we have decided that the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from transport fuel must be reduced, then we are ridiculing our own decisions, and we give an easy argument for everybody who wants to ridicule our whole climate policy, and I simply don't want this to happen. But anything which helps us to be more precise concerning default values of all sorts of fossil transport fuels, I only can say that I welcome all that.
Thank you. Does anyone from the... Jeanette, you want to come back, please? And then we'll open it up to the floor.
Thank you. Actually, I just want to respond to one point here, which is with regards to special treatment for Canadian oil sands. And actually, that's precisely what we're trying to avoid. We've long said that we don't want special treatment for the oil sands. In fact, we actually are not rejecting the idea of a default value for oil sands. Our position is that if you have a default value for oil sands, then you need to have a default value for all crudes. I just want to go back to actually a slide from, maybe if we can get the slide from, no, it's not going to be there, for Samantha's slide. But just in regards to special treatment, our whole point is that how is it that you would treat higher carbon intensive crudes one way, essentially giving them the benefit of treating a Nigerian crude or treating an Algerian or a Venezuelan crude the same way that you treat a Saudi crude, essentially saying that the difference in their emissions is negligible and is insignificant, is irrelevant to EU policy, while saying that the emissions from oil sands are so significant for EU policy that they have to be treated specially. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We have no problem with a value for oil sands as long as the EU applies the same level of rigor for its other sources of imports. And so I think it's exactly the contrary to special treatment that we're looking for. The other thing I would say is on carbon labeling is do not want the carbon labeling to be done correctly. how is it that you could accept a carbon label for a very high carbon crude to be the same as a very low carbon crude? How does that adequately send the right signal with regards to carbon labeling?
Lucia, I think you wanted to speak before anyway. So.
Yes, so I would agree with Mrs. Hassi that basically it's not about singling out tar sands. It's basically we are having debate as if we are singling out tar sands, but we don't see other, let's say, lobbies that produce coal to liquid, shale oil, or gas to liquids coming here with the same vigor of arguments showing how coal to liquid is actually just another source of crude oil that falls within the range of other crude oils. So let's focus on what we're actually debating here. I mean, we have a similar approach on biofuels. Carbon intensity of biofuels depends on the feedstock and production pathway of your biofuel, and nobody complains about that. We have biofuel producers that are actually, that are encouraging their own production processes to improve in order to show that they actually have higher greenhouse gas savings than the default value. And this is exactly the same system that we're trying to put in place on fossil fuels. If the science says that emissions are higher, and we're looking here at industry average, not specific project that happens to be very good in Canada or a specific project that happens to be very bad in Nigeria, we're looking at the industry average, then you have to take this into account and then also provide all these incentives to improve. Because I don't think that these projects will improve by themselves. They need this kind of incentive, and treating them the same as conventional oil is the best way not to get any improvements.
Samantha, please, and then.
There's a lot to respond to here. I think one of the things that I want to point out that I feel like a lot of us here on the panel are in general agreement about is that sources of crude oil have a really wide range of greenhouse gas emissions. I think that's something that everybody can agree on. I think another point of serious agreement, Noosa pointed out sort of keeping your eye on the goal, and the goal is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions of the transportation sector. I think that's also something that we can all agree on. When I hear the talk about differentiating among various crude sources, I mean, if you really want to keep track of what you're emitting, that's kind of what you need to do. But the real challenge with that today is that the data has not been real good. One thing that I will say about the data that comes out of Canada, for someone like me who looks to do rigorous analysis of emissions, it's fabulous. We can really get down to the nitty-gritty. I can look at a project-by-project level. I can look at the best and the worst and everything in between. And I have a good idea of what the range of those emissions are. For many other places around the world, you just can't do that. It would be wonderful if we could have data good enough to do the kind of carbon labeling that Noosa describes so that consumers could really understand what they're buying, whether that be biofuels, whether that be super light crude or super heavy crude, whatever. But unfortunately, that data doesn't exist today. Western oil companies do a bit more disclosure, but most of the oil in the world doesn't come from those places, the kinds of things that Jeanette described. And so there's a real need. We all want to understand and reduce our emissions. I think we could get general agreement from everyone in the room on that. But in order to do that, the information right now is loose. And so we think about what we really, really want, but then we think about how to implement that given the state of affairs and the data we have. It's unfortunately wishy-washy, but it's the best we have right now.
Okay, it's great to take it to the floor.